The world remembers the Vikings as brutal warriors, men who carved their names into history with blood, steel, and fire. They were raiders of kingdoms, destroyers of churches, and conquerors of seas. But what if I told you their most shocking conquests didn't happen on the battlefield? What if I told you that behind the smoke of their burning villages, inside the dimly lit longhouses where feasts turned into chaos, the Vikings indulged in sexual practices so strange, so disturbing, that even their gods seemed to blush? In the sagas and hidden chronicles of the North, we find whispers of wives tested by fire to prove their purity, slaves forced into ritualistic sacrifices of love and death, warriors accused of perversions that could strip them of honor, and even gods who broke every boundary of lust and shame. The Vikings lived in a world where lust was a weapon, sex was a ritual, and shame could kill a man faster than a sword. Before we begin, welcome to Royal Conspiracies, where we bring you history's most scandalous, forbidden, and shocking secrets. If you enjoy discovering the truths that textbooks hide, make sure to subscribe, tap the like button, and share this video with your friends. Now, let us enter the world of the Vikings' most strange sexual practices. When we imagine Viking weddings, we often see roaring fires, overflowing mead cups, and warriors pounding the tables as music fills the longhouse. A celebration of unity, of family, of power. But hidden behind these feasts was a practice that carried fear, humiliation, and sometimes death. For in the Viking world, a woman's body was not just her own. It was the property of her family, a token of honor to be traded in marriage. And before she could enter her husband's hall, she had to prove something that could never be proven fairly: her purity. On the wedding night, the atmosphere shifted from joyous celebration to ritual scrutiny. Historians tell us that in many Norse communities, women were expected to demonstrate their virginity to their new husband. In its mildest form, this meant one thing: blood on the marriage sheets. A torn hymen was taken as proof that no man had touched her before. The next morning, the sheets might even be displayed, paraded before family members or, in some whispers of the sagas, inspected by the husband's kin. It was not love that mattered, it was honor. A man's reputation could rise or fall on whether his wife bled on that first night. If she did not, shame fell not only on her, but on her father, her brothers, and the entire family who had sold her in marriage. Imagine the terror of those women, forced to carry not just their own dignity, but the weight of their entire bloodline into a bed they had no choice but to share. But in some darker tales, purity was not left to chance or biology. Folklore whispers of rituals more horrifying than the bloodied sheet. In certain regions, brides were subjected to ordeals of fire, required to walk barefoot across glowing embers or carry heated iron rods in their bare hands. If she emerged unburned, it was said the gods had confirmed her chastity. But if she faltered, if the flames scarred her skin, whispers of impurity spread like poison. Did these rituals truly happen in every Viking settlement? Not always. Some were likely exaggerated by later storytellers, desperate to demonize the Norse. But traces of these tests linger in sagas, hinting at a culture where a woman's worth was forever tied to suspicion. And yet, here lies the contradiction. In some Viking stories, warriors boasted of women who had known many men, as though their experience made them more desirable, more powerful. To some men, a woman's body was like a weapon, passed between warriors as if each union transferred honor and strength. These women were not shamed, but exalted. Their experience was proof of vitality, almost a divine gift. So why then the obsession with purity? Why demand virginity in one breath and admire experience in the next? The truth was simple. It was never about love or desire. It was about control. Virginity was a leash, a chain that bound women to their families, and later to their husbands. If she was pure, the marriage sealed the honor of her kin. If she was not, it destroyed them. Imagine the scene: a young bride, no older than 16, dressed in fine woven linen, her hair braided with beads and silver. She sits by the hearth, surrounded by laughter, but inside her chest, her heart pounds like a war drum. The feast is over. The longhouse grows quiet. She is led to the bed by her husband, a man perhaps twice her age, chosen not for love but for politics. In the morning, all will know whether she passed the test. The weight of her family's honor presses on her like the sword of Odin himself. If she fails, she may be shunned, beaten, or worse. If she succeeds, she earns no freedom, only another chain. And so, the sacred virginity test was not sacred at all. It was a weapon of fear wielded not only against women, but against the fragile balance of family alliances. But the Vikings' strange practices did not stop at virginity. If purity was the chain, then what came next was something darker still. For in the longhouses of the north, women were not only tested, they were shared. In Viking culture, marriage was rarely about romance. It was politics, a binding of clans, a securing of land, wealth, and bloodlines. But once the wedding feast was over and the vows were spoken, the wife was not always the sole possession of her husband. Behind closed doors, and sometimes even openly, Viking men practiced what sagas describe as the sharing of wives. In some families, brothers would share a single wife, not as rivals, but as allies. It was believed that by bedding the same woman, their bond of kinship grew even stronger, tied not only by blood but by flesh. To them, it was loyalty made physical, a pact that no sword could sever. During drunken feasts, stories tell of women being passed between warriors like cups of mead. Some sagas describe it as voluntary, with women celebrated for their role in uniting men. Others paint a darker picture, of women coerced, their consent irrelevant, their bodies treated as another form of spoils after battle. Yet, such practices rarely ended in harmony. Jealousy festered like a hidden wound. A husband who felt his brother or friend had stolen too much time with his wife might accuse him of betrayal. And in Viking culture, accusations often ended in duels, fights that left families shattered and halls stained with blood. For women, this practice was both exaltation and humiliation. To be shared could mean she was valued as a vessel of kinship, but it could also mean she was stripped of dignity, treated as property to be divided. The ritual of shared wives revealed a brutal truth. In Viking society, loyalty among men often mattered more than the sanctity of marriage. But if wives could be shared among brothers and friends, what then of the slaves who had no choice, no honor, no protection? When a Viking chieftain or wealthy master died, his burial was never a quiet affair. A mound or ship burial awaited him, treasures, weapons, animals, and sometimes human lives. And among those chosen to follow him into death, none were more tragic than the slave women sacrificed in rituals of lust and blood. Our most chilling account comes not from Norse sagas, but from the pen of an outsider, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who in the 10th century journeyed among the Rus Vikings along the Volga River. In his writings, he describes what he saw with his own eyes. When a Viking leader died, his favorite slave girl was chosen to join him in the afterlife. She did not choose this fate. She was chosen. Once marked, her body and soul no longer belonged to the living. The ritual began with intoxication. She was plied with strong mead, drowning her fear in drink. But the liquid courage was only the beginning. In Ibn Fadlan's chilling account, the girl was taken into a tent and forced to lie with multiple men of the household. Each man, it was said, symbolically prepared her for her journey, ensuring she carried with her not only her master's spirit but the seed of his people. To the Vikings, this was not seen as abuse, but as a sacred rite, a grotesque merging of desire, duty, and death. To the girl it was terror. When the morning came, the entire community gathered. The girl, dressed in fine garments, was lifted onto a wooden platform. She looked around, Ibn Fadlan wrote, her face pale with dread, her voice trembling as she sang a farewell song. Then the final horror began. She was seized by an older woman known as the Angel of Death. This woman, a ritual executioner, strangled the girl with a rope while others stabbed her with knives. The act was brutal, but it was ritual, her screams silenced so she could accompany her master into the afterlife. Her body was then placed beside him on the ship, surrounded by riches, weapons, and sacrificed animals. Finally, the ship was set ablaze, flames consuming both the master and his unwilling bride in death. To the Vikings, this ritual was proof of devotion. The slave girl's death symbolized loyalty, binding her to her master beyond the grave. But beneath the sacred words and fiery spectacle was something darker, a culture where women's bodies could be used, broken, and discarded for honor's sake. And Ibn Fadlan, horrified, wrote with disbelief that men who conquered kingdoms, who feared no enemy, built their afterlife upon the suffering of the powerless. But if the slaves were forced to satisfy their masters even in death, what of the gods the Vikings worshipped in life? Gods who themselves crossed every boundary of lust and shame? The Vikings looked to their gods for guidance in war, in love, in farming, and in death. But their gods were not holy saints or flawless deities. The Norse pantheon was a mirror of human desire, raw, scandalous, and often shameful. When the Vikings told stories of Odin, Thor, Loki, and Freya, they weren't just explaining the skies and storms. They were also justifying the strangest, most forbidden aspects of their own lives. Among the gods, none was more scandalous than Loki, the trickster. He was not bound by rules, not of war, not of loyalty, and certainly not of sex. In one tale, Loki transformed himself into a mare, a female horse, and seduced a stallion. From that union, he gave birth to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, the strongest steed in all the realms. To the Vikings, this story was both humorous and disturbing. Loki had not only crossed species, but crossed the very boundaries of gender, becoming female, giving birth, and returning to male form again. Yet, far from condemned, Loki's strangeness was woven into myth. It reflected the Vikings' fascination with the dangerous flexibility of desire, that sex could be used as trickery, as magic, as power. If Loki embodied shame, then Freya embodied lust. She was the goddess of fertility, of love, of beauty, but also of sorcery and scandal. The sagas whisper that Freya shared her bed with gods, elves, and even dwarves. In one tale, she agrees to sleep with 4 dwarves in exchange for the Brisingamen, a powerful necklace. For this, Loki mocks her, calling her a whore before the entire assembly of gods. And yet she remained worshipped, adored, prayed to by men and women alike. To her followers, these stories did not degrade her. They made her powerful, proof that her sexuality was a weapon, a divine force that bent men, gods, and even fate itself. Even Odin, the All-Father, was not free of scandal. He was said to practice seer, a form of sorcery associated with women, submission, and sexual humiliation. For this, other gods accused him of ergi, of being unmanly, of crossing into forbidden sexual roles. And yet Odin did not care. For him, power was worth any shame. If magic required him to endure disgrace, he endured it, because what mattered most was knowledge, victory, and control. Through these stories, the Vikings revealed something deeper. Their gods were not holy ideals, but reflections of themselves. The Norse world did not hide lust, perversion, or shame behind sacred walls. They projected it onto their gods and turned it into myth. But what happens when those myths become more than stories? When sex and magic intertwine, and the act of desire itself becomes a ritual of sorcery. For in the Viking world, sexuality was not only about the body. It was about power, about bending fate itself. In Viking culture, strength was measured by the sword, the shield, and the courage to die with honor. But beneath the surface of brute force, there was another kind of power, a darker, subtler force that frightened even the bravest warriors. That power was seer. Seer was the magic of weaving fate, of seeing into the future, of bending destiny itself. It was the sorcery of women, of witches, of those who walked between the worlds. But most terrifying of all, it was also a magic bound to shameful sexuality. Seer was most often practiced by vulvas, female seers draped in cloaks of fur and beads, their staffs carved with runes. Villages called upon them to see the outcome of battles, to bless harvests, to heal the sick. But their rituals were intimate, secretive, and laced with acts that unsettled even their followers. Some sagas suggest that men who sought their visions had to submit sexually, to surrender their bodies as a price for glimpsing the threads of fate. For the Vikings, submission was the ultimate humiliation. To be passive, to allow oneself to be penetrated, was to abandon manhood. And so, men whispered of Seer with both fear and desire, torn between the power it offered and the shame it demanded. And yet, the highest god of them all, Odin, practiced Seer. He learned it from Freya, goddess of lust and magic, and through it he saw what no other god could see, the end of all things, the coming of Ragnarok. But in sagas, the gods mocked him for it. They accused him of ergi, of being unmanly, of practicing women's sorcery. To them, Odin's power was tainted by the shame of submission. Still, Odin did not care. He endured their insults, because he understood a truth the others denied, that magic and desire were tools, no matter how degrading their path might seem. What made Seer so scandalous was not just the magic, but the way it was performed. The rites often involved ecstatic trances, chanting, and physical acts that blurred the line between spirituality and sexuality. Some rituals required participants to give up control of their bodies, to surrender to the witch, to the magic, to forces they could not see. For warriors who defined themselves by dominance, this was worse than death. It meant giving up everything they believed made them men. Seer revealed the deepest contradiction of Viking culture. They worshipped Odin who embraced it, they feared witches who wielded it, and yet, they despised men who practiced it. To touch Seer was to touch the forbidden. To practice it was to risk being branded unmanly, perverse, dishonored forever. But the temptation was always there, because in a world where war decided everything, the power to see fate was worth any price. But what was the cost of being branded with that shame? What happened when a man was accused not only of practicing forbidden sorcery, but of being ergi, unmanly, perverted, disgraced? For the Vikings, honor was everything. A man could lose his wealth, his land, even his life, but if he lost his honor, he lost his very identity. And nothing struck deeper at a warrior's honor than a single word, ergi. To call a man arger or ergi was more than an insult. It was an accusation of sexual perversion. It meant that he had taken the role of a woman in bed, that he had allowed himself to be dominated, penetrated, or shamed. In a culture built on dominance and strength, this was the ultimate humiliation. To be branded ergi was worse than cowardice, worse than betrayal. It made a man less than a warrior, less than human. And once the word was spoken, it could not be ignored. To accept the insult was to accept shame. The only answer was blood. The sagas are filled with feuds that began with accusations of ergi. One warrior might accuse another during an argument at the feast. Another might spread rumors in whispers, poisoning reputations. The accused would then demand satisfaction, often through a holmgang, a duel to the death. Thus, a single word could unleash violence as fierce as any raid. But why did it cut so deep? Because ergi was not just about sex. It was about power. To accuse a man of ergi was to claim he had surrendered control, the one thing no Viking warrior could ever afford to lose. And yet, behind the fear, behind the bloodshed, sagas hint that such acts did exist in silence. Men who were accused too often, too precisely, suggest there may have been truth behind the rumors. But those truths were buried. To admit them openly was to invite ruin. Better to die with a sword in hand than live branded as unmanly. In Viking culture, sexuality was not private. It was public, political, even deadly. To be accused of ergi meant your enemies had the weapon they needed to destroy you without ever raising a blade. It was a reminder that in a society obsessed with dominance, even the bedroom was a battlefield. But not all Viking sexuality was about shame and insult. Some practices were celebrated, even seen as heroic. For in the longhouses, after battles and raids, another ritual awaited, one where sex was tied not to humiliation, but to victory and fertility. Not every Viking sexual ritual was about shame or humiliation. Some were celebrated openly, woven into the very fabric of their religion and harvest rituals. After long winters and bloody raids, the Vikings turned to their gods for renewal. And the most powerful way to honor them was through fertility rites. During seasonal festivals like Yule or spring sacrifices, feasts erupted into chaos. Drinking horns overflowed with mead, warriors sang, drums thundered, and as the night deepened, the celebrations grew wild. Couples disappeared into the shadows of the longhouse. Others lay together openly by the fire. Sex was not hidden, but offered, to the gods of fertility, to the earth, to the spirits of the harvest yet to come. Some sagas and later chronicles describe rituals where newlyweds consummated their union in public, with witnesses cheering, believing their act would bless the soil with abundance. Others hint at priests or priestesses guiding couples in sacred unions, said to channel the power of gods like Freya and Frey, patrons of fertility. To the Vikings, these rites were not shameful. They were sacred. Where purity tests brought fear, and ergi brought death, fertility rituals brought laughter, hope, and blessings. But make no mistake, even these joyous practices carried a darker edge. For when the line between celebration and frenzy blurred, consent was often lost in the chaos of the feast. And so, Viking sexuality danced constantly between sacred and profane, honor and shame. But what happened when conquest entered the picture? When desire became a weapon against the people they raided? When Viking ships carved across the seas, they brought terror not only with their axes but with their lust. Villages burned, monasteries fell silent, and among the spoils of war were not just silver and gold, but women. Captured women, and sometimes men, were torn from their homes, bound in chains, and forced onto longships. For many, slavery meant years of backbreaking labor. But for others, it meant something worse, becoming sexual property. The sagas hint at this brutality, while foreign chronicles cry it out more clearly. Captives were given as concubines, traded in markets, or kept as trophies of conquest. For the Vikings, domination in war extended into the bedchamber. To possess a captive was to prove one's strength, to display mastery not just over land, but over bodies. Yet hidden in these dark accounts lies another layer. Some captives rose to become wives or even queens, reshaping Viking bloodlines forever. But behind every such story stands the shadow of violence. And so, Viking sexuality was never just about pleasure. It was about power. But what happens when power reaches beyond mortals? When sex becomes a tool to summon the gods themselves? In the shadows of Viking society lurked a power that warriors both feared and desired: seer, the magic of the Norse world. Seer was practiced mostly by women, priestesses who could weave fate, call spirits, and curse enemies. But hidden within this forbidden art was something darker: sexual sorcery. Some sagas whisper that priestesses used sexual acts as part of their rituals, binding men through desire, channeling pleasure as a force to reach the gods. Others hint at rites where sex was performed at gravesites, seeking visions from the dead. For men, to practice such magic was seen as ergi, unmanly, shameful. Yet powerful rulers were rumored to secretly use it, trading honor for supernatural strength. To wield sex as a spell was to risk one's very soul. Those caught in such rituals faced exile, execution, or worse, eternal shame. But still, the whispers remained, that kings and queens alike turned to erotic sorcery when steel and blood were not enough. Magic in the bedroom was feared, but what of magic in the world of the gods themselves? The Vikings didn't just practice sorcery, they imagined their gods doing the same. If the Vikings themselves were bound by honor, shame, and ritual, their gods were not. In the old myths of the North, the gods of Asgard and the giants of Jotunheim committed acts so strange, so scandalous, that even the fiercest Viking might have blushed. No god embodied sexual chaos more than Loki. A trickster, a shapeshifter, a deceiver. The sagas tell how he once transformed into a mare, yes, a female horse, and seduced a stallion. From that union, he gave birth to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed. This was not shameful in myth. It was divine mischief, a reminder that the boundaries of sex and power could be broken, even reversed, when it came to the gods. Odin himself, chief of the gods, was accused of practicing seer, the sexual sorcery of mortals. To the Vikings, this should have been unmanly, even ergi. Yet Odin did it anyway, sacrificing his honor for wisdom and power. It was a dangerous lesson to mortals, that sometimes power was worth more than pride. The myths also tell of giants who lusted after the goddesses, demanding them as brides in exchange for building walls or granting treasures. The gods tricked them, yes, but the stories reveal a world where even divine women were bargaining chips in games of lust and power. These tales were not merely entertainment. They were warnings, reflections of human fears and desires. If the gods themselves could be trapped in strange sexual bonds, what chance did mortals have? But if the gods could indulge in such acts, what of mortals who dared to defy all boundaries, not only among themselves, but even within their own bloodlines? Not even family ties could restrain Viking desire. The sagas whisper of unions so forbidden they were never spoken aloud in public halls. Brothers accused of lying with sisters. Fathers rumored to take daughters. A chieftain who boasted of bedding his own kin, as if defiance of taboo made him stronger. To the Vikings, such whispers brought both horror and fascination. For what greater rebellion against honor could there be than to defile the sacred bonds of blood? And yet, these stories endured, carved into the sagas like scars that refused to fade. From public purity tests to the curse of ergi. From wild fertility rites to the cruelty of captives. From sorcery to shape-shifting gods to incestuous unions. The Viking sexual world was a battlefield of honor, shame, and desire. A world where pleasure could bless the harvest or destroy a man's life. Where women could be worshipped as goddesses or enslaved as spoils of war. Where even the gods themselves were not free from scandal. Their legacy remains both fascinating and horrifying, a reminder that behind the glory of their ships and the terror of their raids lay another, more hidden power, the strange and forbidden world of Viking sexuality. If you found this story as shocking and captivating as I did, then you'll want to hear more of history's darkest secrets. This is Royal Conspiracies, and we uncover the truths others fear to tell. So make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with those who think they know the Vikings. Because the past is never as clean as we imagine, and the secrets of kings, queens, and warriors still haunt us today.